Hey there, extra historians. Welcome to Lies, the part of the show where we tell you all the things we left out, the stuff we got wrong, and where every decade I get new glasses. Last frames lasted a long time. They're still fine, actually, but change is time. Sometimes it's good to change just to change. I'm Rob. I'm the head writer of Extra History. Today we're talking about William McKinley, the Kinley. This is a fun series. I was surprised how much I enjoyed working on this series, to be honest. But first, let's talk about how Lies is made possible by Patreon. Thank you for not only helping us make history that's fun to watch, but also for showing that history is a conversation, because we wouldn't be able to do Lies without you. If you would like to support us, you can support us on Patreon. There's a link in the description. You can help choose our topics. You can vote on episodes. You can get stuff a little bit early. Recommended reading for this week is The President and the Assassin, McKinley, Terror, and the Empire at the Dawn of the American Century by Scott Miller, President McKinley, Architect of the American Century by Robert W. Mary, Triumph of William McKinley, Why the Election of 1896 Still Matters by Karl Rove, and Gangsters of Capitalism by Jonathan Katz. I really want to call out that last one. It's not a McKinley biography. It's actually a biography of Smedley Butler, who was a prominent U.S. Marine Corps general who worked his way up from private, basically. But he starts, his first military experiences are during the Spanish-American War, and he's part of basically every American military intervention from then all the way to World War I, and then becomes America's most prominent peace activist. Part of that is kind of seeing up close the results of, at the very beginning, McKinley's decisions. So he's in Cuba, he's in China, he's in the Philippines. So you really start to get this idea of what these decisions meant for people on the ground there and what conditions were really like versus kind of how sometimes they're described in these more political biographies. A couple of these are by folks that are more conservative. Karl Rove, obviously, was a campaign advisor. I think maybe not my favorite person, but it's worth listening to him on American campaigns. McKinley has started to become a little bit of a darling of American conservatives recently, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. But it has led to a reappraisal of him. I also want to mention The President and the Assassin is probably going to be like the biography you should read. It's very well done. It's a lot briefer than the others. And it's a co-biography of McKinley and Leon Czolgosz. So you can get into the confusing picture of what was up with Leon Czolgosz. Basically, we don't know. He seems to have been pretty mentally ill. He was such a weird dude that even when he approached the anarchists like Emma Goldman, they actually thought he was an undercover police officer because his mannerisms were so odd, and they kind of like kept him at arm's length because they were just like, something's wrong with this guy. Like, we don't know exactly what it is. But he's an interesting case. Like most presidential assassins, he's just sort of weird. Like, people who end up as assassins are generally not psychologically normal in any way. He reminds me a lot of Lee Harvey Oswald, actually, in a weird way. He has that kind of strange political stance. And same thing, right, with Oswald. He goes to the KGB and they're like, yeah, no, just go be far away from us. General things. I found McKinley really interesting, especially in that he's a fairly inoffensive figure personally. I, for a long time, have thought that we don't emphasize enough people who did things that had really negative consequences, not with having not that intention, right? Like, McKinley is not acting out of malice, but some really awful things happen as a result of that. And it's because the greater your level of power, the more you have to think about things. And even McKinley, who is a very deliberate, like, he's a real, like, process-oriented, like, let's get all the facts we can, let's move slowly, let's be incremental, he's that kind of guy. And then he ends up in this position where, like, America takes this great leap. And I think that's very interesting, but he's not like saying awful things like, Pitchfork Ben Tillman, who we talked about before. Or even, Teddy Roosevelt has some real clangers. But McKinley is like very good to his wife. He gives anonymously, like large amounts anonymously to charity. He seems like a personally pretty good guy, but he ends up responsible for these horrible things happening across the world. And in some ways, that is another way that he is like a modern president. Someone like an Obama who seems like just a perfectly good guy, but, you make a decision, it ends up hurting a lot of people in a foreign country, whether that's, drone strikes or, something else. So I think that is what interested me about him so much. Though we'll get into it now, but his family dynamic is also very interesting. We could have done a whole episode just on the relationship between Ida Saxton McKinley and William McKinley. She herself is very interesting and just horribly tragic. Poor woman. Actually, the kind of first big death in her life is that of her fiance, or first fiance, who's a former Confederate, which is unusual, well, feels a little strange to us, right? Because there is this, it's not that long after the Civil War, and they're very much like a Union supportive family, abolitionist, like kind of progressive in the way that you'd explain that in the 19th century. And it feels weird that she would be marrying a former Confederate officer, but this kind of stuff was going on all the time. At the time, there was this idea of reunifying the country, right? And part of McKinley kind of looking the other way on these Confederate burying grounds is very much in the spirit of this, let's all come back together decade. But poor Ida, her mother dies. She has this fall that causes some kind of head injury that seems to have started these seizures, maybe a form of epilepsy. She goes into very deep depressions, even before, but particularly after their second daughter, Ida, dies at a few months old, which being a dad, I can't imagine what that's like. That would just it's a horrifying thought. But, and keep in mind, when I say this, she's not well. She is clearly psychologically unwell and physically unwell. She really ends up deciding that this is because God is punishing her, that she's done something wrong. And she'll do things like take their daughter, Katie, who's 4, and rock her in a dark room while crying for hours a day. And at one point, a visitor, who's a McKinley relative, writes about how Katie is playing on a gate and tells him that, she has to make sure she behaves because otherwise God will punish mother more, which, oh God, you have to be so careful what you say around kids. They'll just internalize so much that you don't realize. And then, of course, Katie herself passes away from, it appears, some kind of heart defect. And again, just a horrible, horrible thing to imagine as a parent. But one thing that's great about William is, he doesn't send his wife away. He keeps her instead close, and he reorganizes his political life and his ambitions so that he can be close to her at all times. This is part of why he does the front porch campaign, right? Is that he wants to be close to Ida and make sure that he's there for her. And there is at one point where they're at a state dinner. I believe this is when he's a governor, and she starts to have a seizure. And he continues with the dinner, and he just takes his napkin and he holds it over her face so that she can have privacy, and make sure he stays with her and takes care of her and just doesn't mind that people are seeing this happen. Very laudable for that time when it was very, very common for people to hide sick or mentally ill relatives. One thing about McKinley's private life, Ida burned all his private papers. She burned all his correspondence. She just torched it all, which was not an uncommon thing for particularly political wives to do. The idea that my husband is a public figure and now he belongs to history, and I don't want his dirty laundry or just, his private thoughts becoming part of the historical record. I want him to have his privacy. So she burns them. And of course, it's not an uncommon thing, but this is why we have to rely on people saying, I talked to McKinley 2 years after he decided that the U.S. should take over the Philippines, and he told me this story about how he prayed all night and he asked God for guidance and all this stuff. And we're okay, we just kind of have to accept it, right? That McKinley told this to someone and we have to assume that they heard the story correctly and remembered it correctly. We have to assume that 2 years later, McKinley hadn't, kind of crafted this story unconsciously or left out details or whatever. But this is a story he told in public to someone, and that's how it was preserved. So the records exactly of what McKinley was thinking are a little soft, actually. Patron question from Bo Carey. I find it very funny and infuriating that the American government is fully aware of its hypocrisy and lies. I wouldn't necessarily put it that way. And then they talk and twist the facts so much to normalize it. But this does make me wonder, when the government considers the whole manifest destiny in murdering Native Americans natural and logical, did they consider invading Spain's possessions not the same because their government were racially and culturally similar? What they considered natural and logical was the idea that they were going to expand from coast to coast. That kind of what is now the continental United States was destined to be the United States. They saw this as unclaimed land, quote unquote, or land that they could claim and move Native American tribes around and nations around. Of course, this involves genocide and all sorts of stuff, but it was more understood than not at the time, or thought more not like logical at the time, that, yeah, well, this is like the British Canada, and like that's Mexico, and maybe some parts of Mexico should be ours, but like we're gonna expand and just like fill that space, and that this is what is supposed to happen. What's interesting is that they don't have that same feeling of entitlement when it comes to other places, right? So they don't feel the same about Hawaii. They don't feel the same way about the Philippines. They don't feel the same way about Cuba, right? It's a really interesting distinction. And even, the Philippines is controversial to the point where the United States does say, okay, well, we are administering the Philippines, but we're in a process of giving it back politically to the Philippine people. That we're kind of a custodian for it until they can govern themselves, right? So it is different but that's because it's very controversial, right? We've talked before about how one reason that FDR rewrote the Day of Infamy speech to talk about Hawaii as the U.S. homeland and not the Philippines, to like split those two, is because he didn't feel that American parents would feel okay sending their children to war because the Philippines was attacked and the Philippines are going to be taken. The idea of a strike on Hawaii was more emotionally resonant because that one's considered like more the homeland, right? Even though it was a territory also. Episode 1, patron questions from Gage Hardesty. In episode 1, how is McKinley directly similar to Napoleon? Because from what I can tell in terms of personality, these two aren't that close. No, they were, in terms of temperament, I would say completely the opposite. American political cartoonists and political cartoonists in general don't need a lot to go on, right? And that's the same today as it was then, right? You think about it's exaggeration, and I think the idea that McKinley looks like Napoleon is an exaggeration. They're looking for something that will be very identifiable. American political cartoons are generally single panel. I love comics, by the way. I love newspaper comics, so this is totally my wheelhouse. So they kind of pick something and run with it. I don't think McKinley really looks like Napoleon. Maybe when he was drawn, when he was younger, he looked a little bit like Napoleon. But they just settled on, we're going to dress McKinley like Napoleon, and when you see a guy dressed as Napoleon, you can tell that's McKinley. I think the same thing, honestly, about like during the Obama era. One of the big things is politicians or political cartoonists would draw him with really big ears. And like, I don't know, I guess his ears are a little bigger than normal, but I never like looked at him and thought like, that guy has big ears. YouTube question. I don't think it's accurate to say McKinley's campaign invented campaign buttons. They invented mass-produced, commercially available campaign buttons. Campaign buttons have existed since Washington's administration. I think I typed campaign buttons too many times. It has lost all meaning. Yeah, I think that's fair to say. A lot of stuff people would make at home too, like, right, with ribbons and, you'd pick colors. You think about like cockades and things like that. So a lot of these things are like made at home. These are produced, they're sold, they're given away. So it's sort of like the modern campaign button, really, rather than campaign button specifically. America's vast rail network, where did that go? Some lines have closed. There are a lot of places you can go where you can go on like a running path or a biking path that used to be a rail line. You can still see the rails. Often they leave them to kind of have a historical element to it. Or they'll have a caboose sitting there or something like that. I just went on one in Vienna, Virginia, which was like that. And it's not just America, like Vancouver. I was just on one in Vancouver that was a former rail line. There is still a lot of American rail network left. A lot of it is just cargo rather than passengers, right? In fact, 2 of the places I've lived in the continental United States were so close to a rail line that I could hear it from inside. And one, this was the apartment I had in Austin when I was in my 20s and I'd just gotten out of college. I could have stood on my back porch, which was a concrete slab, and taken a tennis ball. And if I had given it a really good heave and been accurate in a way I usually am not, I probably could have hit a passing train. It was that close. So yeah, they're still there. And it's still an important part. I've gotten to the point where I find the noise very soothing, actually, after years of living near them. Interesting that this image of McKinley's initials, this is a specific timestamp, were written as MW, probably just because the image got flipped. Yes, whenever we have a character whose initials can be transposed on their name tag, that always causes issues, right? We animate them on computer. There's often like flipping models and stuff like that. Yeah, that causes issues, and we caught almost all of them except for one. You get one as a treat. So it was a MW, not WM. You underestimate the importance of the 1890 Sherman Silver Act. It required the U.S. government to purchase 4.5 million ounces of silver every month and turn them into silver dollars. The silver dollar's value crashed from 80% of a gold dollar to 50%, leading to a run on the Treasury's gold stock, which directly caused the panic. This is a panic of 1893. The Treasury had to stop exchanging gold dollars for silver dollars, and people began to only accept gold as currency. The U.S. government had to borrow millions of dollars, about $2.3 billion today, of gold bullion from J.P. Morgan. Yeah, this is one of a number of factors that caused the panic. Generally, historians don't attribute the panic to one thing. It's a bunch of different things that are interacting. And by the way, this bill was packaged with the McKinley tariff in 1890, right? So, like, McKinley also has his fingerprints all over this, right? Which goes into, like, his concept of bimetal currency, right? When he gets into the presidency. So part of the reason that they wanted to shore up the price of silver was silver miners really getting squeezed by falling silver prices. So this is an example of government policy to a specific interest group going wrong in the same way that, I wouldn't say this has gone wrong yet, but like, we pay a lot to the corn industry for ethanol, basically. But yeah, I wouldn't say it's one thing necessarily. I mean, you can argue about what had the biggest cause, but I think it's a lot of things at once. It's a lot of dominoes falling. I'm going to go a little bit into this question. This is a patron question from Dapper Fox for episode 2. He's talking about a specific book called The Clash by Professor William Lefebvre, who's a specialist in diplomatic history, American diplomatic history, particularly with Latin America and Japan. It's a suggestion that the Japanese government was helping lots of its citizens settle in Hawaii as migrant labor and immigrants to eventually take over the Hawaiian Islands, or that this came into conflict with the overthrow government, and they sent battleships, and the idea was to overthrow the islands and make them part of Japan. And then Alfred Mahan, the Navy's top strategist, called for U.S. to take the islands first and solve afterwards, with the idea that Japan was there was a worry that Japan would take over. One of the reasons I wanted to answer this is I just want to point out, if I have not read a book, it's very difficult for me to answer a substantive question about that or respond to that. I did read a few reviews. A couple of them hit on things that I felt in trying to approach this with what I know about Hawaiian history, which is that this historian in particular has a tendency to talk mostly about the conversation among elites, because he's a diplomatic historian, right? He's reading lots of diplomatic correspondence. And that doesn't necessarily reflect what's going on the ground or in other places in government. But it's a very elites-heavy way of thinking about this. I have no I have no question that someone in the Japanese government was like, well, we have a couple of warships that are there protesting the overthrow and moves by the new government, by the overthrow government. And while they're there, they should just take the islands. And I'm 100% sure that people in the US government were trying to build the annexation case by saying, hey, there are Japanese warships there, so we better take Hawaii before the Japanese do. To me, the timeline just doesn't line up for this being a serious effort by Japan. Also, you do have, a lot of Japanese in Hawaii at that point, but many of them are Japanese Hawaiian. Also they're marrying into local families. It's not so, and there are other immigrant groups, like there's about the same number of Chinese as there are Japanese in Hawaii at this point. And so, yeah, I don't give a lot of credence to that, but it's hard for me to respond because I haven't read that book. But I did genuinely dig a bunch into that. To me, it doesn't make sense with like the timeline of the Bayonet Constitution and all this kind of stuff. But hard for me to say. Maybe if I read the book, I'd think different. Patron question from Bo Carey. Didn't the Hawaiian Queen, this is Lili Okalani, author a new constitution because of business interests, formed a militia, and forced her brother to sign the Bayonet Constitution that removed the monarch's power, stripped Native Hawaiian rights, and gave them control? And did the businessmen already plot to annex Hawaii long before the McKinley terrorists due to their racism? So there's a lot of those. That's a lot of questions all at once. Wanting to undo the Bayonet Constitution of 1887 is a major trigger for the new constitution. There's also the McKinley Tariff. There's also, this ongoing tension, right, that the Hawaiian monarchy has had with these folks that are American citizens and keep insisting they're American citizens, but they have lived multiple generations in Hawaii and are very powerful business owners also, some of which also have intermarried with, Hawaiian ali'i lines or the royal family. So it's a complicated thing that we will get into if we ever do that as a series, which I would like to. But I think the main thing is the plotters were absolutely looking for an excuse. And this is what they took as their excuse, this new constitution, because they knew that after they overthrew the kingdom, they were going to have to justify themselves on the world stage. And, the Hawaiian kingdom had diplomatic contacts with Meiji Japan. King Kalakaua on his world tour met with the Meiji Emperor in person. There was members of the royal family corresponded with Queen Victoria and attended her jubilee not too long before. So they knew once they carried out the overthrow, they were going to have to show some kind of cause. And this provided the cause that they argued. They're like, we're revolutionaries. We're like a constitution was being foisted upon us. Of course, they foisted a constitution on the government, right? But so that's where that comes from. But it's a very long, complicated question. Patron question from Gage Hardesty. Episode 2, how does dust help with the explosion of the Maine? Because as far as I know, dust is not exactly flammable unless there's a reason for it being able to light up explosive. Coal dust is. Coal dust is extremely flammable. And also it's very combustible, and also it responds to pressure. So if you have this coal bunker, so it's this sealed coal room, and there's coal dust in the air, there's off-gassing, there's all sorts of stuff. The idea is that you build up pressure and you build up this combustible dust. A fire starts, it heats a bulkhead, which sets off the adjoining magazine, right? So there's a couple of different theories about this. There are people who don't rule out an external mine. It seems quite unlikely at this point, but there are people who will still argue for it. But one of the leading theories is the idea that it's the buildup of coal dust in the coal bunker and essentially design flaw. YouTube question, interesting and painful that from the Western perspective, America saw the Philippine forces as mere guerrillas, whereas in 1898 they had the workings of a Congress, a judicial arm, and the leader of the guerrillas, you named as Emilio Aguinaldo, has was declared president, the USA did not put down an uprising, it quashed and invaded a fledgling nation. Yeah, and that's one reason the occupation becomes very unpopular with parts of the American public, you know. It's always really important to remember, because a lot of this stuff can get ironed out a little too smooth when it comes to things like textbooks. But frequently when the American government takes some big swing or seems to like double back on its own policy or something like that, there are people that are vocal about not approving in the United States. You know, it's not like the US is a monolith, right? There are people during other major US policy things that are now looked at very darkly, like, you know, removals of Native Americans, that are like, this is awful, we shouldn't be doing this. You know, and it's important to remember that. That the US political body is not 100% unified and never has been, right? There are always going to be dissenting voices, and you have to look to find those. They frequently fall out of history because, you know, this was the decision that was made and this is what was carried forward. And you tend to, some people will often like not quote those dissenting voices. And I try to include them, but genuinely it's hard, like especially when you're doing stuff short format, right? Backbone of a chocolate eclair is my new favorite insult. Theodore Roosevelt was very good with words. There's a reason he became president. Hey, longtime Filipino fan here. Hey, glad you guys are covering McKinley, given his role in this country. Just want to say that Aguinaldo is pronounced with a hard G sound, like an again, like the word again. Otherwise, thank you, and please keep up the good work. Thank you. I try to provide examples and use pronunciation. Sometimes I pick one that's not the best one. So I apologize for that. That's my bad. Episode 3, patron question from Gage Hardesty. This has become a continuation for me watching the 3rd episode of William McKinley. So this is a question basically that in episode 2, we mentioned that the Filipino casualties of the war as 100 to 200,000. In the second episode, in episode 3, we said 200 to 250,000. He asked if this was a difference with like civilian casualties versus military casualties. Is this just a mistake? So the tabulation of casualties from historical conflicts can vary widely. My guess is I used one estimate for one episode, and then when I was looking back, I used a different estimate for the second episode, or I also could have just made a mistake. There's usually a couple weeks sometimes between when I write these. So perhaps it's just a typo. I actually noticed after episode 3 was posted, but usually at that point it's too late to change. So I would usually I go with the lower end estimates in general, 100 to 200,000. That's just sort of a rule of thumb I follow, because I feel like these can get sort of escalated out of control sometimes. So I will often kind of go with something in the middle. But it's entirely possible that I just copied the wrong stats when I was writing this one, or I just typed the wrong thing. YouTube question. He couldn't appoint, this is McKinley, couldn't appoint a new vice president when Hobart died. There was no system in place for doing so at the time. Yeah, so there wasn't a formal system for replacing the vice president until after the JFK assassination, where it's like, we should probably solve this. Because it actually happened many times. I think it's something like a total of 37 years that the vice presidency has been unoccupied. But I think what happened here, and I was listening to this book actually, and I remember exactly where I was in central Hong Kong during this section and what I was doing. I know the exact building. I was walking through the Prince's Building, which is like a mall/office tower. And I think what I got wrong about this is this was talking about McKinley's delay in choosing a running mate for the election of 1900. He was a little weird about this. Often presidents would say like, hey, I would like to run with this guy, or at least express a preference. McKinley expressed kind of like a mild preference for one guy, and just never really, and this made his advisors crazy, never really just went like, just let the convention decide. And he saw the potential of Roosevelt, but he didn't really choose him. And this was like sort of a baffling thing to people around him that like, why are you not more involved in this? It did become kind of like a little bit of a political attack, this idea of him like ruling alone. And also, you know, is he just indecisive? But he was a little bit weirdly lackadaisical. He'd be that way about some things like that. I think also, you know, particularly with caring for Ida, I think sometimes that would take up a lot of his mental space. And because, you know, his letters got burned, we don't really know what was going on internally with him, right? So I wonder if that played into it. Coming up on Extra History, a history of mass deportation. We're going to be starting to look at deportation in the early days of the American Republic, and then also the 1930s, the first raids that are really focused on Los Angeles, and then 1953's Operation Wetback under Eisenhower, which seems to be the basis of what is happening now. After that, ancient Egypt, Alexander the Great's Egypt. This is about the formation of the Ptolemaic dynasty. How did the Ptolemies get started? And then we're going to do one on historical tyrants, and I'm looking through the suggestions for that right now. It's very cool. We're going to start a new thing now called Rob Recommends, and we have a great one first. It is Chief of War, which is on Apple TV. It's the Jason Momoa series, talking about the unification of the Hawaiian Islands and Kamehameha. It has such great stuff in it. I am so happy with it. This is the kind of thing that people from Hawaii have been wanting for decades, is like a big budget TV/movie about this period, because it is so cinematic. It is very Game of Thrones, and I'm just so happy with it. All the little details. There's these little things that are just go unexplained, but if you know what you're looking at, you're like, oh, that's so cool. You know, like Kahekili II, right? He's tattooed down one side because he's emulating the Hawaiian god of thunder that is supposed to be black on one side. Timur Morrison does a fantastic job making him every bit as menacing as he should be in this story. I think Jason Momoa does a really good job. You could tell it's made in Hawaii because in the first 5 minutes of the episode, I saw someone I went to high school with. So I'm like, yes, clearly. There's also another actor that a friend of mine worked at Walden Books with in college in Ala Moana Mall. It's great. And they clearly went into the Bishop Museum in Honolulu and like just went into Hawaiian Hall and started pointing at stuff and being like, I want that as a prop. I want that as a prop. I want a prop based on that. I want a feather cloak based on that. I want kahili based on that. It's so neat. There's all these little details that I keep picking up on, and I'm very happy with it. It's mostly Native Hawaiian too, which is great to see. Highly recommend you watch it. I want them to make a second season so bad. I almost want to like do a show where I just talk about that because I'm fully on board. Love it. They do change some stuff, particularly timeline things with John Young. He kind of comes in earlier than he's really supposed to. I feel like the Oluwalu massacre is going to be changed a little bit, but that's still to come. If you watch our Kamehameha series, it looks like they're going to do the first season as basically the first episode of our series. I can't wait to see more. I'm really enjoying it. That's like my Friday night thing now. So I just sit down and watch Chief of War. And thanks so much, and I hope you'll join us for next time. Have a nice day.
So there I was with Ziliad's Architecture, Lotus Wolf, Kuya Koi, Joseph Blame, Hunter Z, Dominic Valenciana, Benjamin Daniels, and Angela Valenciana, and I was like, y'all, you're the best! And they're like, we know.